Hey, what's up guys? This is Theo here, and today I'm going to give a presentation that I recently gave at my job to the development department. So the title of the presentation is React.js and Friends, a concise introduction and presentation to the JavaScript ecosystem in 2017. So I'm recording this November 11th. I gave this yesterday, November 10th. So for the last year, I have used a lot of these technologies, predominantly React, WEBPACK, REDUX, JEST, Babel, ES678, and sort of a lot of the surrounding JavaScript ecosystem. So I sort of want to discuss, benefits of using these and just the tooling around it. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is React? React is a front-end JavaScript view library created by Facebook. React's been around since about 2013, and React makes a lot of good use of vanilla JavaScript. It uses ES6 classes, so you can write class-based components. Modern JavaScript, that's a huge plus. That was a very big factor in us moving to React. We wanted to write the latest and greatest JavaScript code, but also be able to use something like Babel, a compiler that would let us write JavaScript that would compile down into sort of older or sort of more compatible JavaScript that works in later or earlier versions of browsers, and so that we can support more end users. So React, like a lot of front-end frameworks nowadays, it follows a component-based architecture. Everything in React is a component. And this favors a common design principle, composition over inheritance, right? And what I mean by that is when you have a component-based architecture or you're composing a lot of things, you'll start to see as you get deeper into this that when you're not inheriting from everything and instead of you're just enhancing things, there's less coupling and sort of less tethering of different services and layers together, and it creates a less flimsy architecture and code base. It's less brittle to change or more feature implementation. So React encourages a modern, I'm going to use this pointer, React encourages a modern development ecosystem. So some of the tooling is ES6, 7, and 8, just ES Future JavaScript. WEBPACK is a module bundler, we'll talk a little bit about that. And REDUX is a implementation of a flux pattern. And by flux, I'm talking about the sort of design pattern where you have a sort of single source of truth, which is your state, and then at least with Flux, you have dispatchers, and with Redux, you have a store, reducers, and actions, but you're never mutating that state directly. It all is happening in this flow of dispatch and action goes to a reducer. The reducer decides what the new merged copy of your state is going to look like. State will change, and all of these changes will get propagated down to your components, okay? So this is really nice for predictability and single source of truth. So moving on to that, just diving right in. React has two main concepts that you really need to grasp going in. And I believe these two main concepts, the best way to start is to say React begins with props and state. Props are passed in. These are properties and attributes that we want a component to have. State is the sort of life cycle of that component, the sort of design and sort of different UI state of that specific component. And these are things that can change, whether it's toggling of buttons, data that we get back from an AJAX request, or anything really that is dynamic. This is state, right? So props aren't going to change, but state will. So why should you care? Okay. So let's sort of look at this, right? So career development, I think this is a big one. Look at the number of companies using it. So React actually has a developer extension, and I'm not going to show it here, but it's the logo of React, with like a black background, if I got that right. And every time you're on a page that's using the production or development build of React, it'll show up. So if you sort of keep this in mind, it's almost like a heuristic. You can go ahead and sort of see that now. You sort of see it more and more now that I mentioned it, right? Next is the number of stars on GitHub. As I make this presentation, React has about 80,000 stars. That's very impressive for an open source library, and huge community behind it. And also, total numbers of stars, it's about the third most starred repo on GitHub. And then some popular companies using it are Netflix, Amazon, Instagram, and Facebook. Why should you care? It's very important in 2017 to have a good working knowledge of JavaScript. It's not enough anymore to just get by with, bringing in a jQuery plugin for everything. There's complex UIs, tons of state, different and changing requests of clients, and to build a large-scale application that is not subject to a lot of technical debt, as well as provides a robust code base, you need to have good understanding of design principles and vanilla JavaScript, right? So by learning React, I believe that you strengthen your core skills and your underlying knowledge of the language. Next, from my experience, from tutorials, books, job postings, etc., React and the surrounding ecosystem in 2017 currently is the future of modern front-end development, along with WEBPACK and ES6, 7, 8. Again, just look at the number of stars, the job postings, etc. Next, it encourages declarative and functional paradigms. So I want to make the comparison to something like Angular 1 or AngularJS now. That is a MVC. Again, React is not an MVC. React is a Vue library that facilitates, right, building your views and massaging your data. So React is functional by nature, just different ways of doing things compared to Angular 1. So a good example with Angular 1 is that Angular 1 has this idea of sort of your view and your model updating together, synchronously, and then your controller is sort of the glue between those, right? Sort of like the dispatcher, the intermediary. But with React, we have a one-way data binding. So this might be sort of a paradigm shift if you've been using Angular 1 a lot and you haven't gone into React, or even with Angular 4 or 5 now, or something like Vue. But this is just one of the things that you want to learn, and this is very important. Again, goes back to that sort of predictability. You'll see, as I described later, we have to tell React we're not going to update the state ourselves, but we're going to instruct it by using a method called setState on the component that will then in turn, perform or enqueue an update behind the scenes and return to us a merged copy of our state. So again, just more predictable right there. And finally, React forces you to think about architecture and design patterns. As you're building components, you really want to go towards components that are reusable. A big one is dry. Don't repeat yourself. Yagni, you ain't going to need it. So don't build out components just to build them out, right? There's a certain point at which you've modularized your components enough, and you don't need to keep building out a component that's like 3 lines long. KISS, keep it stupid simple, and inversion of control. This is also known as dependency injection. And when I say that, I'm basically just talking about React higher order components. We'll talk about that a little bit. And higher order components are components that are enhanced with some additional functionality. And again, this goes back to the idea of composition over inheritance. Okay, so benefits of using React. The benefits of using React, in my opinion, are first, a very minimal API to learn. So just looking at what's in parens here, we have setState. This is a very common method to use. We have a render method that's required when we're building a class-based component. A component, and then this is optional, but you can tap into these. These are component lifecycle methods to hook into the lifecycle of the component. Another benefit, you stay recent with development trends. If you're watching tutorials, if you're looking up GitHub trending repos, if you're reading JavaScript weekly, etc., React and the surrounding ecosystem is definitely the big dog. You're going to see it everywhere. Next is the virtual DOM. So we have the DOM, which is the document object model, and this is basically a representation of the web page, the nodes, on it, what's being painted, what's being rendered on the screen. So what React does actually behind the scenes is it has a virtual DOM, which is basically just a copy of your node tree, and it stores it in memory. Every time you make an update, basically it does a sort of diff between the DOM and what you have updated. And you can actually see this by turning on in Chrome, looking at the developer tools and seeing what sections of the page are repainted. And again, I'm not going to show this here, but you can look into it, any page that's using React, and sort of see what portions of the page are being updated, and sort of see, look at the performance and see exactly what's being re-rendered. So this is really cool. There's also component lifecycle methods, like I said, that you can tap into to sort of optimize this. This is getting a little bit more advanced, but just to sort of bring that to your attention. Even if you don't fully understand it, I'm not saying I do, but this is something that is there for your benefit, and it is just another benefit of using React. And yeah, I'm sure some other front-end frameworks are implementing this now too. I was just pointing it out with React. Next, React is not coupled to specific syntax. You think about Vue or AngularJS, or even Angular 4.5. There's no ng repeats, and there's no forced reliance on specific services. That's what I really like about React. So, talking about AngularJS or even Angular 4.5, there's a specific HTTP service or a specific router that goes along with it, right? And you have that concept of dependency injection where it's like, this framework is super opinionated, so we need to use these things. React is not like that. There are certain tools that the community has sort of brought up and promoted and popularized, right? Like React Router, Redux, right? But there's other things. You can use Mobex, you can use Inferno, you can use whatever you want, different libraries. So your service layers, your routers, etc., are up to you. So this gives you as a developer basically the choice to work at sort of implementing your front-end stack however you want. So one example I'll show later on is basically a HTTP wrapper that we built in our last project that basically just wraps the XML HTTP request just for a GET method. And we just sort of promisified that instead of bringing in Axios as like an HTTP client. And next, minimal technical debt. So I'm a huge minimalist in terms of building out web applications. I actually suck at stuff like jQuery because I never use it. I prefer to use vanilla JavaScript as much as I can, just because I think that's really core to your understanding. And you want to be able to have a deep dive and deep knowledge of the true skills, because this is your field, this is your expertise. So you improve your vanilla JavaScript skills, and you don't waste time on learning a framework-specific syntax that could be deprecated in a year or two. So the counter argument is, okay, well, what if React goes, out of style? That's true, but again, I think with this very minimal API to learn, you've still developed an immense knowledge of, building a clean architecture. You've developed underlying JavaScript skills. You've developed more of a functional style programming, and you've sort of strengthened your knowledge of the underlying internals of the language. So I think the pros outweigh the cons. So React is the third most starred repo on GitHub. So if we look at this picture here, we have FreeCodeCamp, a great resource, highly recommend that. And then we have Twitter Bootstrap, which is the CSS framework for styling. Then we have React, and then we have Vue. So Vue is really the only contender behind React. Again, this was taken, I want to say like 3 days ago. But we can see React has a huge amount of stars. And obviously, I'm just doing it by JavaScript, but whatever you do it by, it's still in third place. So that just shows you this is a crazy, leap and just powerful sort of project that everyone has credit around. So let's build a component, so we've talked a little bit about writing some code with React and just the ecosystem in general, but let's go ahead and write it. So let's look at this, right? So if you're not familiar with all this, let's start from the beginning. So here on line 1, we are importing React and component from React. So don't sort of worry how this gets, compiled and what's happening behind the scenes. Let's just go over this step by step. So this first one, React, is what's called a default import, right? So without the braces, we are saying we want the default import from React. You can also alias it, right? Not in this case, you wouldn't want to, but anything else you could. So we're just importing React. This is the main React library. The one in the braces component, this is a named import. We're saying, give me this object, right? Or this class in this case, off of this node module, right? So, and then we have a few other things that we'll talk about here, right? Here's some services, some, dummy services we might have. But anyways, let's get down to it. So I'm going to show you a class-based component. And so this is just a simple JavaScript class. There's no real magic in here at all. Classes have constructors. So let's go to this first thing. So React allows you to validate the props, the data passed into your component. So this is very helpful when you're working with a team of developers and you have adjacent developers that are sort of going into your code base and looking, or say you have a backend developer and he's looking at what that component expects, and this might help him to model the data or the query that's coming back from the database to fit more appropriately with what's being passed into this component. And also when you're running React in development mode, you will get warnings in your development console basically telling you, hey, this prop type is required, right? Comments are required, but you have not passed them in, right? Or you have passed in prop types, but they're not of type array. So this is just very helpful. And again, we're declaring this as a static method. So this means that we don't, we could log out dashboard.prop types. We don't need to instantiate a new instance of the dashboard class. This is just a method on the class. So next, again, I have state here too. This is not a mistake. I'm just showing two ways of writing state. So if we have any props that we want to be part of our state, we need to set our state in the constructor. So the constructor is the method that is called on instantiation of the class. When we say new dashboard, that's when the class is first created. That's when this constructor is called. So in this case, we're taking in some props, and so because this class is inheriting from the base class component, we need to call super with these props, pass these props to the base component, and then we will set our state in here. So in this case, we're setting users to an empty array, search term to an empty string, and we're saying, hey, we want our state of comments to be props.comments, okay? So again, this is somewhat of an anti-pattern to set your state equal to your props, just because if these ever change, you're going to have to, say it's, with a AJAX request or whatever, you're going to probably have to tap into a lifecycle method that we'll look at later called component will receive props, and this takes in, or this is passed new props and, or next props and next state, or new props and new state, sorry. And basically you're going to need to check there if, the diff between these two is changed and then update that, right? But it's still fairly common. There are cases where you would, want this to happen. You don't want to ever mutate props, right? Because that's what's being passed in. It's not supposed to be mutated, but you want to mutate the state. So this is actually like a valid reason. But if you're not going to mutate at all, don't set the state to it. Say you're just going to map over it. You don't need to set it state. State is supposed to, state is something that's changed. Whereas users, right? Users is going to be an empty array right here. And in this component, when it mounts, we're going to go out to some, backend service, fetch the users and update the state. So that's the difference here. If we don't need to pass any props to our state, then we can set state right here. You notice I have omitted this keyword. That's again because this is referring to the this of the component, right? So this is the same as the this keyword is the dashboard. So again, it's going to reference the component. So same sort of thing right there. We're just setting our state, and you can also say this.state. It doesn't matter. So just going through that. So let's sort of look at this, if you guys can see this well enough, what a component is compiled down to. So really, it's just ES5 code. This is ES 2013. So in React 16, newest version of React, class-based components are preferred, sorry, not favorited, and I believe you'll get a deprecation warning if you're running it in development mode. I don't really see any like new modern resources using non-class-based components unless you're running like functional stateless. But to declare, a component like this with React.create element, right? It's not that common. One, it's not that intuitive, and two, it's pretty tedious, right? So here is our class-based component, it has the render method, and then we're rendering it to the DOM. We'll talk about that in a bit. But this is what it looks like. Again, this is from the React docs. So what we're doing is we're creating an element. The first parameter is the sort of HTML tag. The next one is, it looks like, is the children. Okay, so again, everything in React, parent-child relationship, top-down. And the third one is the actual markup, right? The JSX. Again, that maps to that. And the props, right? So we're going to pass in the props. And then here the props is right there. So we're creating the element, right? So cool. That's just what it maps down to if you're curious about it. And then again, that's why we need to import React at the top of the file, because that's what's going to be called. All right. So components continued. Let's look at lifecycle hooks a little bit. So again, lifecycle hooks. This is a lifecycle hook to clean up any timers or subscriptions when your component unmounts. So this is component will unmount. You might use this for timers. You might use this for event listeners, so you don't have any zombie listeners hanging around. And you might also use this if you're using something like REDUX, where you're subscribing to a store, or say you're pulling a server. Again, that would be like an interval or something. You want to clean up all of those things when the component unmounts. A good example of a component unmounting is, say, with React 16, you have a COMPONENTDIDCATCH lifecycle method, which will sort of propagate any changes, any like reference or type errors up, right? So you click on something and it's just like, cannot read property, whatever of undefined. You'll be able to intercept that and return a clean UI from that instead of it just blowing up. But at that point, your component will be unmounted from the DOM tree. So if you don't remove these will just be lying around. Wow, really, it's pretty useless at this point. Component did update, and again, I didn't put the properties in here, but these most of these take new props and new state, and then also context. But we're not really going to talk about context. Component will mount. This is anything you want to do right before the component mounts. You're not going to have access to the DOM at this point, so I don't use that often. Component will receive props right before the component receives props, and should component update. Again, if you wanted to use something like this, so we looked at before, let me go back, we looked at using a component. There's also a pure component named export that will never update, so it's almost just like a stale component in that sense, like it's just a one-time thing, similar to like a one-time binding with Angular. And the most common one is component did mount. So here the component is mounted to the DOM. We're free to interact with the DOM and make any AJAX calls that might be needed to fetch data. So say we have a user service, getting the users, right? And then when we get it back, then we're gonna update the state, okay? And then we could, log some data out to a logging service, right? This is all dummy data, but sort of just going through the lifecycle methods that you might want to use. And this is really cool. A lot of front-end frameworks obviously implement these. React isn't the only one, but this sort of lets you tap in or intercept different points at which the component is composed of throughout its life. So let's look at a function or an event handler. So this syntax might seem a little weird given that these are just regular functions, just class functions. But here we're setting a function equal to an anonymous function. And the reason we do this is, as we'll see below, we want to keep the context of this relevant to the component itself. And when we set it to an anonymous function, anonymous arrow function, it's basically just going to not have its own context. It's going to take the context of the parent, and in this case, it's a method of the class. The class is the component. So here we are handling a key down event. Not complex, not going to lie, pretty simple. You know, it's past the event. This is actually a synthetic event in React. So React wraps events, and it tries to normalize events across all browsers. So it's not perfect, but you know, the normalization I'm a big fan of. So here we're updating the state. We do not want to mutate state directly. This sort of goes, again, with the functional principles of React. And so there's a few interesting things about this. One, React batches updates behind the scenes. What does that mean? So right before a render, right? So, or right before sort of a repainting of the DOM, you know, React has almost like, if you're familiar with like the event loop with JavaScript and event queue, all those things, and how that works. React behind the scenes calls basically an enqueue method, and it's going to put, because that method is asynchronous, it's going to take a bunch of those sort of states and merge them together, and then it's going to you know, return a merged copy of the next state when it's time to repaint the DOM. Okay, so there's two. Again, this is a mistake. There's two different ways to write this. There's actually three. I'm just going to talk about two. So this first one is set state. Okay, so this is, again, this is referring to the component. So the first one takes in an argument of an object. So here we're just saying we want to update search term to event.target.value. Again, this is just going to be the current value of like an input field or a text area, whatever it might be. So this, again, is going to update the state. So the method to set state is synchronous, but the method set state is using behind the scenes is asynchronous, right? So if we were to log out set state after, or if we were to log out console.log this.state after this method, it's not guaranteed that we're going to get the same state as what's updated with this. Okay, you have that race condition going on because this is asynchronous. Here, this is a pretty common one. Not everyone knows about this. I think a lot of people do, but here's an alternative way of writing this with the callback. So here we're updating it, and the next argument is a callback function, and this will be called after the batch updates have happened and everything's been enqueued, and we have that merged copy of the state. So we know that this is the updated state for search term. If we log out state.search term, we are going to have an in-sync sort of copy or in-sync string here that represents the current search term of the state of the component. Okay, so now let's look at a render method. So the render method is one of the few things that's required. Okay, this is going to be called on your component with React when it goes to look at what sort of the markup and the UI of your component wants to look like or needs to look like. And again, going off of the syntax, this is what's called JSX. The best way I can describe JSX is a combination of writing HTML, JavaScript, and sometimes CSS within your component. You might think this is an anti-pattern, again, that you don't have this separation of concerns if you're not used to React. You know, ever since I learned to code like 2 years ago, or anyone learning to code, you're definitely taught don't put your HTML in your CSS, or sorry, don't put your like CSS in your HTML, like inline styles. Don't put JavaScript in HTML, whatever. Just don't mix all that stuff. You want to have clean separation of concerns. So you might be a little bit opposed to this at first, but I really have grown to like it. So a few things about this. Like I mentioned before, everything in React has a parent and then children. So when React goes to look at this with that React.create element, it's looking for one parent, okay? So that's why we have this outer div, this parent div, right? So say we had a div here, you know, one of these, we just copy this from line 89 to 95 and then paste it below to 96 to 101. And if we did that, right, then what would happen is we would get an error in our console saying, you know, React is looking for one utmost, you know, JSX element, one utmost parent, right? And again, that's because what will happen behind the scenes is it's looking for that parent and then it's going to do pretty much like a recursive search and look for all your children and build out that tree, the markup tree of what what your component is supposed to look like. So let's look at a few more things, right? So just some ESX if you're not familiar with it. We're saying const and then embraces search term this.state. So what this is literally saying is const search term equals this.state.search term. This is called destructuring. We are literally plucking off a property of the state. Okay, so just kind of a nifty way, and then we're putting it into a variable. You can do this with many properties. And next, what we need to do here, this is return. This is returning the markup. So the reason why I have these parentheses here is because this is on multiple lines. This is just some formatting. Without this, we would get an error because naturally it's looking for one line, but we can get around this with the parentheses. Just formatting, and then also it's easier to read. Next up, I didn't put this in the state. I should have, but say we have, all right, I didn't destructure this, but right, say, I had users here as well. So with something like Angular or a lot of other frameworks, we have like a for loop or an ng repeat. With React, because it's functional and declarative, we are going to use a map. We're not using a for each because a for each doesn't actually return anything and you can't break out of it. So a map is what we use. And so we're saying for each user in this user's collection, using this fat arrow without any braces after it, this is going to be an implicit return. So we're saying return to me a user component. So we're going to actually, let's see if I have that back up here at the top. No, I didn't import it, but so we might import this component. And again, we're modularizing the users to have a user component. Next, we're giving a key. A key is very important for React behind the scenes to optimize. So an anti-pattern, again, is actually using an index as a key because if you have sorting or something like that, these could actually really not be representative of the unique identifier of this. So a good idea would be some sort of GUID or something really unique, some sort of hash. And then this next property with ES6, is what's called the spread operator. So this is saying for all the properties that I get with this user object, just spread them out across, spread them out as props, right? So if this had a name, this would literally come out to like name, age, height, whatever. Next, let's look at this. This is kind of a cool concept in React. This is basically just an input statement. Normally with regular, JavaScript, or I guess let's think Angular, you might have like ng model right here, and this will bind to whatever model you're using, and then that's all you have to do. That's the glue. Again, because React is more declarative, you're going to have to sort of handle these things yourself, and we'll go back to the previous slide to look at that. But here we're setting the value to search term. We can sort of see, here's where we're updating it on this key down. I don't know, I should have changed that to on change or yeah, maybe I messed that up. But anyway, so we're handling this event on change, or maybe I should have done it on handle key down, whatever. But anyways, so this basically we're setting a anonymous function. If you just have one argument, we don't need any parens. And here's pretty much our callback function. When we get this method, let's call this method right here on handle key down past the synthetic event, and let's update the search term with event.target.value. So if I don't put this value in here, we are, if I don't put this on change method in here, nothing's going to change, and we are actually not going to be able to type in at all, because this is what's called a controlled component. A controlled component in React is a component that we are pretty much handing over to our component and saying, we're going to implement a method to handle this. We're just not going to, pretty much let any input in here. Anytime something like this happens, we're pretty much subscribing to this method and this methodology to handle updates, as opposed to an uncontrolled component where anyone can type in anything, and the value search term is less predictable. So components continued. Hopefully my fan on my computer isn't too loud. This is what's called a functional stateless component, as opposed to a class-based component, which is let's go back. A class-based component is mainly for your business logic. It's also called a presentational component. It's going to handle all of your methods, events, AJAX calls, etc. We have a functional stateless component, and this is what's known as a dumb component. A dumb component, at the end of the day, takes in some props and returns a UI. That's about it. So we have the same structure here. The only difference is this is all this is a function, right, that returns some JSX. We could write this without, setting it equal to an anonymous function, or we could write it, set it equal to an anonymous function, take out the braces, and take out the return statement, and just have the parens right there, just so we have that implicit return. But in this case, I just wanted to show the more sort of verbose way. And again, you could do some logic after this if you want, but you want to keep it as stupid simple as possible. By default, the default argument here is props. And again, we're using destructuring to pluck the name and age property off of props. And then we're showing this, right? So again, before we had this user, this is what this might look like, name and age, and then we're just rendering that out. Cool. Finally, let's look at how to render a component to the DOM. So here we are querying an element by its ID, storing it in this variable element, and say we have an array of comments, right? Say we are getting this, from the server or something, or here we just have it hard-coded, and we just have it at the time, we're passing it to props, just very basic array. What we can do is use a method off of the React DOM library. React DOM is the implementation of the React DOM, the virtual DOM. And so because React can be written on the web or also for native or desktop mobile applications, there's two different DOMs. There's a React DOM, and then there's a DOM for React Native. We are just looking at React DOM for web. So there's a render method, and its arguments are one, the component. Again, this looks just like an HTML tag. You just need the / right there, closing it, and then after that, we want the mounting point. This is where React is going to, almost like an append child or insert adjacent HTML element. That's where it's going to insert it. And then the third argument, even though you might not need to use it, is a callback function. So cool. Advanced concepts. Let's look at some higher order components. So a few examples of these are connect in Redux. If you're familiar with Redux, this will connect your component to the store and let you sort of map different actions to your properties, or map different actions to your props, and pluck different properties off of your store to use in that component. You're essentially just enhancing your components. You have less coupling of components, again, less inheritance, and you're following that design principle like I mentioned before. So on the site that I built, we have an enhanced calendar that we've used because we wanted a calendar to be used for both a date picker and also as just a calendar. Cool. So this is sort of the way that I like to describe a higher order component, and this is what makes sense to me, is you can think of it like a middleware that adds some functionality to your component before handing the enhanced component back to you. So you have a component, you have a higher order component, which is a function that accepts a component, and this returns to you the enhanced component with additional functionality. So let's look at this. This is kind of hard to see. You might have to zoom in. Can't zoom in on the slides for some reason, but this is off of the React Bits book. So here we have a title, and this is just called inject. It takes in a component, and all it does is return the component with the title, right? So here, this is very reusable. We might have, some data that we want to share all over the place. And again, we are just calling this inject with title, right? And we are just enhancing that component. Next, I want to look at conditionals. This is a component that built for one of the projects I worked on. And so if you do any React, with conditionals, you're going to have to use ternaries, or you could use an anonymous function and then do a bunch of if statements, but that's not really used that much, I wouldn't say, or that encouraged. So ternaries are your main option. So what I built was just a simple if a functional stateless component that's called if, and basically this looks at a condition and the children, and if the condition is true, right, that's passed in, go ahead and return the children, otherwise return null, right? So just don't show anything. So this is a very good example of taking advantage of React's component architecture to build something that is pretty useful throughout the application. And again, this is more, in my eyes, intuitive than having to do tons of nested ternaries. So, and then down here, not really going to get into this, but I built a compose method that basically will enhance the component, look at its prop types, and then return a function that, when invoked with the component, will export the enhanced component. Okay, so next let's look at an error boundary component. This is a lifecycle method, COMPONENTDIDCATCH. That's the lifecycle method or lifecycle hook that we can tap into with React 16. This is another thing I've wrapped all of our components in. So like I talked about before, say you have something that's going to blow up because of just mismatch of data, and you have reference error, you're trying to open like a modal or something. You have this COMPONENTDIDCATCH, and if you wrap your components in it, these errors will be caught and propagated. So the COMPONENTDIDCATCH method is passed an error and its info. You then update the state, and by updating this state, you can sort of decide here what UI you want to return. And still, the component will be unmounted from the DOM tree, but you're sort of able to intercept this, and instead of just creating a poor UI, poor user experience at that point, you can have somewhat control that's more fitting over what you're going to return to your end user. And then again, here we just have some logging, just so that we can sort of not leak this out to the user. Otherwise, return the children, which in this case would be the component that is being wrapped in this error boundary component. Cool. And then this is what it looks like in practice. We are rendering out a gallery component, and then we're wrapping our error boundary component in there. Awesome. So this is kind of hard to see, but here is, I want to talk a little bit about React and the surrounding ecosystem. I don't know why it says October. Oh, I guess I built it. I started this presentation October, but October, November 2017. So we'll go through a few of these. I just want to talk about some of them. So the first one is WEBPACK. This is a module bundler. It's almost similar to Gulp or Grunt, except for it's a lot more declarative, and from my experience, it's a lot easier to work with, and it does have a pretty steep learning curve, but there's a lot of great things you can do with it. The main concepts in WEBPACK are loaders, and loaders are basically just regular expressions, or basically just different sort of transformations that you do on certain files, whether it's JavaScript or CSS, that again you're looking for a matching regular expression, and then you can apply this transition to them. And plugins are almost like middleware again for WEBPACK that you can use, and something like this could be like an Uglify JS plugin, something like that, basically that will enhance your application, or like a Purify CSS. You can write your own. So those are the main concepts in WEBPACK. Yeah, so, and then one of the other things we'll talk about too is HappyPack, and this is just a sort of intermediary step, almost like a middleware for your loaders that will spin up node processes to give you greater parallel, or just parallel processing in general, so you can have multiple threads for your loaders and get a way faster build time. ES6, 7, 8. I love using async await as opposed to working with a ton of callbacks or promises, but I still enjoy promises. I like using like promise.all and stuff like that. Destructuring default arguments, arrow functions. These are some of my favorite features. Redux. Redux is a centralized state management. You have a single JavaScript object that represents the state of your store, and then you have the concepts of reducers, actions, action creators, and this is really great for predictability. There's a lot of great documentation out there and really great dev tools for it. JEST, ENZYME in Istanbul. This is for testing coverage and mocking components. Yarn is a registry for node modules. It's similar to NPM. A few differences are it's deterministic. It has caching, and it's fast. It's really fast, and it creates a yarn log file, and this is similar to NPM shrink wrap. Then I like working with NPM scripts. It's really nice. React router, use this with one of our projects. It's a lightweight router built on top of history object and the push state. Not that opinionated either. Axios, HTTP client, and then it's promise-based as well. Fetch is a wrapper around the XML HTTP request, promise-based as well. And Bluebird is a promise library that has a lot of other cool features too. Lets you cancel promises, etc. Then some linters. We have ESLint, CSSLint, standard. This is for like formatting and like making your JavaScript look better. PostCSS. We have CSS modules, styled components, CSS grids, flexbox. Classing or hashing of class names. Immutable JS, again, creating immutable data structures, so you have greater predictability of your data. You can't mutate your data directly. You have to use immutable methods. I like that. Babel is a compiler that lets you write most modern day JavaScript and compile it down to support older browsers. Another cool concept is server-side rendering with React, and this is for SEO benefits, for performance, and again, just speed. Travis CI, this is for continuous integration. You can run your tests on each push to GitHub. It's similar to GitHook, and it's not going to push it unless you get green builds. Coveralls is for coverage. Jenkins, that's more continuous integration. And then one thing I'd like to explore more is, it's kind of hard to see PM2 with Node, and this is basically a cluster of Node processes or Node servers that works with load balancing, so it keeps your app alive forever in production mode by spinning up more Node instances if needed, and works like a round robin. So depending on the load of the server, it will spin up another server and sort of distribute some of that load there. Cool. So next one, let's look at a simple Webpack file. Again, you might have to zoom in a little bit to look at this, but here I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Here's just the imports, and this is what it looks like because Webpack uses Node behind the scenes. We're using modular exports to export an object. You could also export a default object, and we're just returning this few properties: the watch, true. So it's looking for different arrays or strings of entry points, an output, and then a few more properties we'll look at here. Here's some loaders, as you can see. Here's an example for SCSS. Here's what it's using, what kind of loader. Here's what we want to include, right? And then down here we have some plugins that we might use. Like the common chunks. We want to sort of group like our vendor, our third-party libraries all into one, so to avoid duplication across the project. So obviously, again, that was a pretty quick intro to Webpack. I don't want to go over that too much. It's mainly about React. So Redux is a centralized state management. It's implementation of a Flux design pattern. Like I said before, you keep all your state in a single JavaScript object. The idea behind Redux is you do not mutate your state directly. Instead, you have this pattern. An event occurs in an application, say a click, some sort of event. You dispatch an action handled by your reducers, and you return a merged copy of the state. And that you would do this, by either using object.assign, a spread operator, etc. And basically, it's a single source of truth for your state. It's useful for a dry and clean architecture. So here's a store example, one we used in one of our apps. So here we have an initial state for our events. So here's everything that we want to use. Here's down here is we're creating the store. Create store is a method off of Redux, and we're exporting it. So I just wanted to show the initial state. Like this is basically the nucleus of your state. The only time that you're going to set it yourself directly. This is an example of an actions file. So again, this is we're setting a variable equal to the same name, just in a string. And these are great it might seem a little redundant. Why are we like setting a variable equal to the exact same thing, like toString, whatever, or as a string? This is to avoid typos and just to create greater consistency, so you don't have to think about this as much when typing it, right? Is it lowercase, whatever? These are called action creators. These are just functions that return an object with the type, right? So makes it a little bit more portable. And this is a reducers file. So a reducer looks like this. It's a function set equal to an anonymous function that has a state. And again, we're setting it equal. The default argument, if there's no state, it's going to be the initial state. And then the next one that it's going to be passed to is the action. And then here we're using a switch statement to look at the type of the action. And then again, we're getting these from our actions file. We're going to look at it, so on this one, on open calendar, here this ... this is the object rest spread or object spread operator right there. So we're saying, give me everything in the state, and then I just want to update these properties. So we're merging these two together. So JEST, ENZYME, use this quite a bit. Testing for React components. You have ideas of shallow rendering, mounting, and that's with ENZYME. So you can get pretty deep insights into the component tree of the specific component you're looking at. JEST is a test runner. ENZYME can render shallow and deep copies of your components. And Istanbul shows testing coverage and the consoles, line numbers, etc., percentage of components tested. Here's a good example, like I mentioned before, of a lightweight HTTP service built on top of our promises. All of our other services extend this class so that they can tap into this this get method with the super keyword. That's going to call it this base class. So again, this just takes in a URL, returns a new promise. We're just promisifying this HTTP request. So we're sort of abstracting this away. So again, sort of goes back to that idea with not just React, but with ES6 and building out a architecture that is more minimalist and yet still relies on modern design patterns like using promises. And finally, other cool things that we've done in my team with this workflow. One is Preact Compat. So if you're familiar with Preact, Preact is a smaller version of React library. But we didn't want to change out all of our React to the Preact syntax. But Preact Compat basically is a solve for this. That back in our Webpack file, there's a property you can put on there called resolve, and then there's a property on there called alias. It's an object, and so you could set stuff like you could set React equal to the node module React, right, which would be kind of pointless. But you could also set React and React DOM to Preact Compat, and what that will do behind the scenes is it would look, Preact pretty much will take over and look for any reference to React, and in your build swap it out for the minified version of Preact. So that's pretty cool, and it'll bring your project size down tremendously. The only downside is you're not going to be able to even tell that the project is using React, and you're not going to really have any help from React in terms of debugging at that point. So that's why you want to have a flag turned on, basically for development or production at that point. Purify CSS, talked about that a little before. That's really great. So you want to use something like Bootstrap, but cut out all the bloat because you're not using everything. Then we have post CSS class hashing. That's pretty cool, but it's kind of tough to debug. I've heard styled component sort of solves that. I haven't really looked into it. CSS modules is just importing basically a JSON file that has mappings to your hash classes, and then you can access these with dot bracket notation, and then WEBPACK, already talked about that. And finally, where to learn more, a few resources. You have Udemy, Front End Masters, Egghead.io, Pluralsight, YouTube, React Bits, GitHub React repos, and the React docs. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this presentation. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. As always, thanks for watching, and have a great day.